The YouTube gaming community has long since exhaustively covered the TurboGrafx 16 and its failure to gain traction in the Western markets, due in large part to skepticism and, shall we say, excessive thrift from Japan, and rank ineptitude in the West. However, that comedy of errors had a pleasantly surprising consequence that doesn't get nearly the credit it deserves. It more or less birthed the import gaming scene as we know it. That's what I'm here to talk about today. Welcome back to Little Akiba Games. I'm Patrick. Let's get started. The TurboGrafx 16 story is a pretty well-known one at this point, but for those who are just learning about it today, here's the breakdown. NEC's PC Engine was a legitimate competitor to Nintendo and Sega in Japan, and did remarkably well on a reputation of very strong arcade ports, original games that fit right in with them, and a relative affordability that endeared it to gamers on a budget. It was depicted very well as such in the anime series High Score Girl, which I have to believe put a lot of new eyes on the system. Unfortunately, their attempt at opening a Western branch was undermined out of the gate by an obsession with focus groups and on packaging the system and its lineup not necessarily for a Western gaming audience, but for out-of-touch 80s marketing executives' idea of a Western gaming audience. They dragged their feet so badly micromanaging their Western vision of the platform that it caused them to walk right into the Sega Genesis launch just 2 weeks before they themselves were ready to go to market, which completely negated all the momentum they could have had. Add gross reluctance by the Japanese side to fund the Western side after all of that, knowing they were coming out of the gate a generation behind, on top of one of the most atrocious unforced errors in the history of our medium, that's pretty much the story. Still, there were TurboGrafx 16 owners out there. The narrative usually fixates on only 300,000 of the 750,000 launch units selling through, but that does mean that there was an installed base in North America, and a decently strong one by late 80s and early 90s standards. The Western release pipeline, while remarkably consistent in providing good games overall, was the definition of a drip feed. To put it simply, there were hundreds of thousands of gamers in North America who really needed stuff to play, and they weren't getting it under the TurboGrafx label. Gaming magazines were well on the rise around this time. What was once a one-act medium with Nintendo Power had now expanded to include GamePro, Electronic Gaming Monthly, Die Hard Game Fan, and the ridiculously underappreciated Video Games and Computer Entertainment, which was later rebranded as simply Video Games. With these newer magazines came a consciousness of the global nature of the industry, and the fact that every system had its titles that we were missing out on for lack of licensing and/or localization ambitions over here. No one was feeling this more than the TurboGrafx owner, and the magazines latched onto that. In particular, it felt like not an issue could go by of EGM without them promoting a litany of awesome PC Engine or PC CD titles in development in the International Outlook section, which especially flew in the face of the reality of what little was getting released here in North America in comparison. The secret was out, and TurboGrafx 16 owners knew that they were getting a raw deal. This became especially apparent when the PC Engine landed Street Fighter II Champion Edition months in advance of the Super NES and Sega Genesis double packs of Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting. At the time, Champion Edition was still tearing it up at the arcades. A lot of locations were now running Hyper Fighting, meaning the copies of World Warrior available on the Super NES were now 2 versions outdated. People were craving more Street Fighter, and amid wishful thinking rumors of boss codes and desperate Game Genie usage to expand the playable roster with less than desired results, the unlikely PC Engine became the first console home of this iconic revision. As someone who was already steeped in the local fighting game community at the time, I can say from first-hand experience that this was definitely a tipping point for a lot of people who either imported PC Engines from outlets that were now aggressively promoting themselves in the same magazines that made North America aware of the import pipeline in the first place, or equipped themselves to start importing games on the TurboGrafx 16 consoles they already had. Unfortunately, I was not one of these gamers. Although I had a TurboGrafx 16 already at that point, my family was fundamentally opposed to having or using credit cards, which was a hard cutoff from the mail order market. The places that usually seemed safe to order from simply did not offer COD purchases, and I'd say I'm showing my age by even mentioning the concept of COD, but since I'm already talking about shopping for and buying video games from magazine ads in the early 90s, I figured that ship has long since sailed. Things only got more disproportionate from there as NEC's Western management gave way to puppet firm TTI, the Turbo Duo rolled out, and NEC refused to fund the licensing and localization required to give the Turbo line anything even loosely resembling an attempt at parity with the PC Engine. They just gave up. What we got over here was nice. I will never dispute the quality of games like Legendary Axe, Blazing Lasers, Ys, Ninja Spirit, or even the oft-reviled Keith Courage and Alpha Zones, but it was practically a demo selection of the system's broader library, which forced a lot of people into the import market in order to access the real TurboGrafx. As just a sample, the list of games we missed out on included the aforementioned Street Fighter II Champion Edition, the horribly underrated Final Soldier, quintessential party game Bomberman 94, cult classic shmups Nexer and Gingafuke Densetsu Sapphire, formative JRPG Dragon Slayer 2, brilliant ports of Gradius, Gradius 2, Life Force, Ninja Gaiden, Outrun, Fatal Fury Special, Raiden, Darius, Darius 2, and Shinobi. And finally, the linchpin exclusive Akamajo Dracula X Chino Rondo, or Castlevania Rondo of Blood, which I recently rated as the most monumental import release ever. If you bought all of your TurboGrafx games from the domestic release calendar, you got table scraps. If you found a good import outlet to source your library from, you were eating real good. This wasn't the absolute starting point for import games in North America, and I don't want to mislead you to believing otherwise. I still remember seeing cartridge converters back in the 80s that allowed you to plug Famicom games into the Nintendo Entertainment Systems that people were far more likely to have here in the States. But that was more of a novelty than anything else, as despite the obvious notable exceptions like Final Fantasy III, the NES actually enjoyed a decent chunk of what was released on the Famicom. Meanwhile, the inexcusably massive gulf between the TurboGrafx 16's domestic lineup and the embarrassment of riches featured on the PC Engine practically demanded Turbo owners look abroad for their software, and this created a significant community of gamers who routinely made their purchases from Japan, even as far back as the early to mid-90s. By no means did this practice die with the TurboGrafx 16 either, thankfully. Similar, if smaller, movements started emerging for the Super NES and Sega Genesis, and anytime a system launched from that point on, its software library would be scrutinized against its Japanese offerings, and often fell short. This created a boom market for importers to sell Japanese games in North America for platforms like the Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation, and eventually the Sega Dreamcast. From there, the entire concept of region locking died a slow, welcome death, starting with the PlayStation 3 in 2006 and eventually extending to the Xbox One in 2013 and the Nintendo Switch in 2017. Today, getting into import games is a simple matter of heading over to PlayAsia, Amazon, Video Games Plus, or another similar outlet and confidently buying your games knowing that they will work on your system, regardless of what region you purchased it from. There's even a good chance that English language support will be right there on the disc or cartridge. These are good times indeed. Oftentimes, a solution to a problem won't emerge until the problem becomes bad enough that finding a solution goes from being a nice thought to an absolute imperative. There's no question that we missed games from Japan on the NES, the Sega Master System, Super NES, and Genesis, but if it hadn't been for NEC leaving the TurboGrafx 16 to starve, the disparity between the North American release lists and those of Japan might not have ever become so pronounced as to start a movement, at least not nearly so much of one as what we ended up with, and certainly not so quickly. That's all for now. This has actually been the first of what I hope will be a series of videos about the PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16, so if you enjoyed this, then definitely look forward to more. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you support import gaming culture, and especially import gaming coverage. Click the notification bell to know right away when a new video drops. I look forward to seeing you back here next time at Little Akiba Games.